Well, today I want to spend some time thinking about what it means for us to care for one another in our church community as we follow God into this new year. I want to approach this a little bit differently today than I usually would, rather than stepping through a particular passage like I normally do. Rather, I want to explore an understanding of care by looking at two images of care that we see used throughout the Bible story. So I'll first do a quick sketch of these in the Old Testament before seeing how Jesus and the New Testament writers pick up on these images so that we can think about what it means for us as a church to care for one another. And just before we get going, my desire that lies at the basis of this is that we would be thinking and exploring how we care in our community, what it means for each of us personally to be involved in this care. And so I'd love you to be thinking about that as we go along. Well, the first image that gives us insight into care in the church community is the metaphor of the sheep and shepherds. Sheep, in fact, are the most frequently mentioned animal in the Bible. A bit of Bible trivia there for you. They're mentioned nearly 400 times throughout the scriptures. And then on top of those mentions of the sheep, shepherds are mentioned about 100 times. There are two reasons why there are so many mentions. First, because sheep were so central to ancient Jewish life. Sheep were used in all different areas of life, from using their milk in cooking and their meat for food, to using wool and sheepskin for clothing. Ram's horns were used to carry and to store liquid. Ram's horns were also used as musical instruments, and of course sheep were commonly used in the Jewish sacrificial system. Sheep are so much part of daily life in different areas of life. But what it meant to look after sheep was very different then to what it is today. You didn't just make a big grassy paddock and let the sheep roam free in relative safety within the fence like we do now, but you needed shepherds to constantly take care of these sheep. It was a semi-nomadic lifestyle, going out each day looking for good pasture and water for the animals and protecting them from the wild animals that would try to kill them. You could say that the Jewish faith actually grew out of a line of shepherds. You can see this if you notice who the shepherds are in the Bible. Abel, the son of Adam and Eve, was a shepherd. Then the patriarchs of the faith were shepherds: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses was a shepherd when he was in Midian. And King David, this archetypal leader in the Old Testament, out of whose line the Messiah was to come, is a shepherd. All of these people were shepherds by profession. But then many of them are also described as shepherds in the way that they lead and by the way that they go about what they're given to do. And this is the second reason why there are so many mentions of sheep and shepherds, because of how they acted and what they did made them a really good metaphor for spiritual realities too. And this is why God himself is also understood throughout the scriptures in terms of being a shepherd of his people. The classic example is when the shepherd David in Psalm 23 describes God as his shepherd and builds the psalm around the typical day in the life of a shepherd. The good shepherd in the Bible is the picture of proper care and compassion. It's a picture for us of what God himself is like toward his people. The shepherd provides places of grazing and watering, green pastures and streams for the sheep to feed and lie down in. That the shepherd guides the sheep along right paths to get to their food and to safety. The shepherd protects the sheep even through the darkest valleys from wild animals that come to attack. The sheep can even eat their food in the presence of their enemies because the shepherd protects them. Shepherds are constant companions to the sheep, following them all the days of their lives as these figures of authority that the sheep will respond to when the shepherd calls them, because the sheep know their voice and they know that the shepherd cares for them and protects them and provides for them. The metaphor of a shepherd becomes a dominant metaphor for leaders in the Old Testament, both to describe good leaders who reflect God as their shepherd, but also to warn and to call out bad leadership who, by the way that they act and demonstrate, poor care of those who are they're supposed to protect as shepherds. And so at the center of this metaphor, we come to understand God as a shepherd and his people as his sheep. But alongside this general picture of God as shepherd, this picture is also used to anticipate the coming of Israel's Messiah, who will be one like David, their great shepherd king. Here's one of the prophets, Ezekiel says, he says, prophesies, my servant David shall be king over them, and they shall all have one shepherd. They shall walk in my rules and be careful to obey my statutes. There's a really quick sketch of the shepherd metaphor in the Old Testament. And I want you to hold that and then think alongside that there's a second metaphor, which is a metaphor of family. Just as you might say the story of the Bible emerges out of a line of shepherds, so you could say that before they were shepherds, they were all in families. And the Bible story is about God's family from beginning to end. Start reading the Bible and it's not long before you come across these long lists of names. And even when you don't know who any of these people are, you see that family lines are somehow important to this story. Right from the beginning, the creation account describes God creating Adam and Eve in his image to look and be like him as part of his family. They are created as children of God. God makes families the basic building block for society. His plan all along has been to make sons and daughters who will work and rule with him in his kingdom forever. But while this creation story shows this is his intent from the very beginning, almost as soon as it starts, the story also shows this picture of family going all wrong. Because with the arrival of Adam and Eve's children, we see the central example of a pattern that carries through the rest of the Bible. Cain's hatred for Abel, to the point of murdering him, in fact, is this archetypal example of sibling rivalry and family breakdown. God confronts Cain after he's just killed his brother, and God asks him where Abel is. Cain's answer reveals his heart, and he says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Cain really asks this question rhetorically in the account, but the fact of his action shows that he doesn't actually know the answer to it. Am I my brother's keeper? The silence in the text in response to his question suggests that the answer should be obvious to him, but sadly is not. But even as this family of Adam and Eve falls apart in the narrative, families remain the central instrument of God's grace in the world. God calls a man named Abraham and says that through his family, the whole world will be blessed. Read through the Old Testament and you see how central family is to the story. We don't just hear about people's work, we hear about their work in the context of family. We hear about the families of Adam and Eve and Noah and Abraham and Lot and Isaac and Jacob and his sons. We hear about Moses as a husband and as a father and as a brother. We learn about David in the context of family as the youngest son. We learn about him as a brother. We learn about his failings as a husband and as a father. The story of the Old Testament comes to be one long epic about this family called Israel, named after one of its patriarchs. But even with this earthly family, God himself gradually comes to be re-understood as the father of this family. And the hope that everyone in this family holds is that one day, through this family, God will send a son to sort things out for them, to reconcile and renew everything that's gone wrong. When we think of care for our community, these two images are central, because we see them as images of care in the Bible. Shepherds who care for their flocks after the great shepherd who cares for everyone, and families as an image both of disappointment and struggle on the one hand, and God's ultimate hope and blessing as Father of all people. It's interesting to see how the New Testament writers pick up on both of these images. So now I've given you a sketch of them in the Old Testament. Let's have a look at what happens in the New. First of all, thinking about family. The fact that this whole story is grounded in God's purposes being worked through family is one of the reasons why Matthew's Gospel starts with a family line, stretching right back to Abraham. And in Luke's account, the list goes further back right to God. Jesus is born into this human family of Israel, and he comes calling God his Father. Jesus calling God Father might be radical enough, but then what he does is he teaches his followers to do the same, to call God Father. He teaches them to pray, "Our Father in heaven." What is Jesus doing by this? He is forming a new family when the family of Israel had all but failed. Jesus reframes this failing of family lines down through the generations back towards God's purpose for family in the beginning, to live in intimate relationship with God who made them based on what he says is right and wrong, and in intimate relationship with one another, unashamed, for the ordering and flourishing of all of God's creation. There's an account in Matthew chapter 12, it's also in Mark and in Luke's Gospels. Jesus is speaking to a crowd and his mother and brothers are standing outside and asking to speak to him. And someone says to Jesus, "Your mother and your brothers are standing outside and they want to speak to you." And Jesus asked, "Who is my mother? Who are my brothers?" And then he pointed to his disciples and said, "Look, these are my mother and brothers. Anyone who does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." Jesus is reframing a picture of family around God and his purposes for family in the world. A family not defined by bloodlines, but by looking to God as Father in order to live according to his purposes in the world. And then look what Jesus does with the image of shepherd. At the beginning of Matthew's account, Jesus is identified as this shepherd ruler who the prophets had spoken about. Quoting the prophets, Matthew, the writer says, "For out of you, Bethlehem, will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Jesus in his ministry speaks a lot about sheep and shepherds, of himself searching for the lost sheep and bringing it home in his parables. He identifies himself as the shepherd of the abandoned and scattered people that he cares for and that he gathers. Then in John chapter 10, he describes himself as the good shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. He says, "I am the good shepherd." The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. Jesus here identifies himself as the good shepherd who leads all of his people to pasture, to life. And here in this passage, he refers to other sheep as well, beside Israel, that is, the other nations. And what Jesus is doing here is identifying himself as the great shepherd of the people that Israel had waited for. And he reorients the whole sheep and shepherd image around himself. The shepherd is no longer just one figure in the story, but the very center of it all. And he says hear that the shepherd is actually going to die for the sheep. And then with Jesus, his metaphor is flipped. When his death is spoken of not only as the shepherd dying for the sheep, but also as the death of a lamb amongst brothers, the most vulnerable in the flock. Jesus dies, according to the New Testament writers, as both the lamb who takes away the sin of the world and as the shepherd himself, laying down his life for the sheep. Revelation 7 puts both of these images together, saying, "For the Lamb in the midst of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of living water." At the end of John's Gospel, Jesus has risen from death, and he reinstates the Apostle Peter and commissions him as a shepherd. Jesus asks Peter if Peter loves him, and when Peter says yes, Jesus' response to him is to look after other people like a shepherd looks after sheep. "You love me?" He says. "Okay, well, feed my lambs. Take care of my sheep. Feed my sheep." And so Peter becomes one of these shepherds of the early church. Then later in one of the letters that Peter writes to the church, he says that pastors and elders in a church are all called to be shepherds. He says, "I have a special concern for you church leaders. I know what it's like to be a leader in on Christ's sufferings as well as the coming glory. Here's my concern, that you care for God's flock with all the diligence of a shepherd, not because you have to, but because you want to please God, not calculating what you can get out of it, but acting spontaneously, not bossily telling others what to do, but tenderly showing them the way. When God, who is the best shepherd of all, comes out in the open with his rule, he'll see that you've done it right and commend you lavishly." This image of shepherd is crucial as we think about care in the church. But it's very interesting that this isn't the image that the Apostle Paul uses throughout his letters. He only speaks of sheep once, in fact, in Romans 8, speaking of the fact that as Christians, we face difficulties in this life. And quoting Psalm 44, he says, "We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered." He only uses the sheep image once, and he only mentions shepherds once as well. And this is in Ephesians chapter 4, when he says that God has given the church shepherds as one type of leader amongst others, with the job of equipping the rest of the church to serve one another and the wider society. Rather than referring to sheep and shepherds, Paul addresses the church with the family metaphor. He addresses the church as brothers and sisters more than anything else. He calls God's people brothers and sisters more than he calls them the ecclesia, which means the called out ones, and where we get our understanding of the word church. When he refers to the church, he usually does so by calling them brothers and sisters. And Paul's language of brotherly and sisterly love, if you look at it, it's passionate, it's intimate, it's affectionate. Hear the way that Paul speaks of people in the churches that he writes to. To the Philippians, he writes, "For God is my witness, how I yearn for you all with the affection of Christ Jesus." He says, "My brothers and sisters, you whom I love and long for." To the Thessalonians, he says, "Being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us." He also says, "Brothers and sisters, when we were orphaned," here he's using the language of family, but about losing family. Being orphaned by being separated from you for a short time, in person, that is, not in thought, out of our intense longing, we made every effort to see you. If you read the list of people that Paul greets with affection in Romans 16, you see that he knows these people. There's an intensity about the bond that he has with these people. He uses language of presence, of really knowing another person. In Romans chapter 12, he says to the church there, love one another with brotherly affection. When we see the word love here, some people say, oh yes, I can love the people in the church. It doesn't mean I need to like them. I'll just try to be nice to them and to say hello. But the word love here describes being tenderly affectionate. You don't do that with someone that you don't like. Then that's fair enough, because you feel tense and you feel self-conscious around them, or else cold and dismissive. The love described here is the kind of at-homeness and unself-consciousness you have with a friend you feel so comfortable with, you don't even think about trying to keep the conversation going or worry about the times of silence. And when I say that, some immediately might feel this is a burden. Oh, Steve's now saying that I need to like everyone in church. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying, is there one person that you can go deep with? Is there one person you can really be open with? And if you can find one person, well, that's a great start. Paul says here, love one another with brotherly affection. I don't have any biological brothers, but I've seen the kind of affection between brothers that comes over years and years of relationship, forming into deep bonds. And Paul is saying these are the types of bonds the church is supposed to form. What Paul is describing here is intimate, and it's warm, and it's emotionally connected. This isn't to say that pursuing this is easy or that it just happens. The reality of church family is that it still includes our human families, which remain broken and confusing and at times very, very difficult. I think Frederick Buechner recognizes this when he says, a family is a web so delicately woven that it takes almost nothing to set the whole thing shuddering or even to tear it to pieces. Yet, the thread it's woven of is as strong as anything on earth. Human family is so fragile, but with a bond as strong as death. And I think this is the point Paul wants the church to embody. This is why Paul employs this metaphor so extensively, not because family is easy or perfect, but because it expresses something of God's intention for his people, the bond that is theirs because of Christ. God's church are these people who are being brought together as family unto him as a loving father because of Jesus, our brother, who has made a way for us to be included. One commentator puts it like this. He says, when the writers of the epistles refer to their fellow believers as brothers and sisters in the Lord more than 100 times, they're not simply a decorative or emotionally compelling image. The physical family is not a concrete picture of an abstract idea, rather is one step toward an even greater reality. These writers are addressing fellow members of an eternally real spiritual family whose origin is the ultimate reality, God. Can I suggest that the only way to form these kinds of bonds is to intentionally spend time with others? Find people you can be honest with, to be vulnerable, to learn to express, to let our guards down, to take our masks off. Might help you get the picture today. Some might say, why would we want to do that? Doesn't that just lead to pain and hurt? It has great potential for that, yes. But you'd want to do that if you were serious about being formed into people who do God's will. And that doesn't come automatically by turning to Jesus. You'd pursue that if you want to be one of those who Jesus describes as his mother and brother and sisters. Remember what he says? Anyone who does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. So how do you learn that? We've been talking about a model for this as a community that hopes to help each of us develop this type of intimacy with others. And we're suggesting that you could find this place by forming a prayer partner, finding a prayer partner, a prayer duo or triplet, or with a group of others. Maybe you're from a big family. And I would love to see that happening right across our community. But the point is not signing up for another thing for you to do. And that's why I'm reluctant to say, this is what you should do. Because it's more a question I want to ask you. If you want this in our community, what do you think it looks like for you to pursue it? What I am suggesting is that if we're going to share the joy and difficulty and pain and sin in our inner world, which is necessary to share if we're going to be formed into the image of Christ, we need a place of intimacy and vulnerability and people that we can actually be honest with. If that's best for you to do in a group, great. But if it's with one other person, great. The point is finding others that you can come to know intimately as brothers and sisters in Christ, and where we can help one another learn and do the will of the Father. This is the question I'm constantly wrestling with, and I'm inviting you to wrestle with it too. What does it mean for us to care for one another as Gordon Baptist Church? And to answer that question, I think it's helpful to take these two biblical metaphors and to examine them and to work out how we care for one another in light of them. Pastors are called as under-shepherds of the great shepherd. And I take this calling and task very seriously, and I live very aware that I will be held accountable by God for how I protect and guide and provide good pasture for those that He has put under my care. And God may well be calling some of you to be shepherds like Him. And I believe that He will continue to raise up shepherds among us. But maybe you're not a shepherd, and the dominant image for many of us in our church community would actually be of family. The fact that Paul addresses us as siblings in Christ. Let me leave you with this question. What does it look like for you to be a brother or sister to others in our church community?